Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. So today we're going to be tackling a question that I don't think is so much a debate in the community at large, but more something I think we debate internally as we go about building and painting our Warhammer models, or indeed non-Warhammer models if you happen to be into those games. And that's, do our models look better with or without their helmets? Now, this video isn't going to give a definitive answer to that question. It's merely meant to open up the perspective a little bit and show why so many models, particularly on the Games Workshop web store, are displayed without their helmets, and to kind of talk about the visual benefits of each and why you might want to consider doing one if you've only done the other up until now. So back in the past, Warhammer leaders and characters weren't these great centerpiece models that we have today. They were far more simpler and they tended to blend in with other models that you happen to have in your army, particularly with the Space Marine factions. You'd have heroes and leaders wearing very similar armor, and because of the scale of models back then, they didn't necessarily have a lot of features that would make them stand out from a distance. So unless you were prepared to kit bash those models extensively, one of the easiest ways to make them stand out from range was to have them not wear helmets. And I'm thinking of things like Captain Cortez, or even just the leader of your Space Marine tactical squad. Unless you were going to put the banner on that particular model, just not having a helmet would also make him stand out amongst the other 9 Space Marines he was leading. These days we've got many more multi-part kits, and with that choice of options comes the personal question of what we think looks best on that particular model. But with helmets, I think that's erred into the question of, does one option look sillier than the other? And that's really well illustrated by the Invictus tactical warsuit. Now, many people have talked about this model in the context of this question before, so I'm not saying anything particularly new, but the crux of what people say is, if you're going to armor yourself with a tactical warsuit and go into some of the more dangerous and hazardous war zones that even Space Marines can go into, why wouldn't you wear a helmet when a single headshot or an unfortunate accident could put you out of action? Now again, this video isn't arguing one way or the other. I think both looks are really cool, but I think it's also fair to say that Games Workshop does like the aesthetic of models without helmets. And you can see that in the fact that every single Primarch in the Horus Heresy, the models at least, don't wear helmets. Again, the Horus Heresy was one of the most bloody, dangerous conflicts in the entire setting of Warhammer 40k and 30k, I guess. But with the exception of Lionel Johnson, Alfarius, and maybe one or two others, Games Workshop has deliberately decided not to give many of these characters helmets. And I think that's because they're presented here not necessarily as warriors on the front line, but as characters in an overarching story and drama. What is different though is when you want that particular option and you don't necessarily get it, and we see that with models like the Black Templar's Marshal and the new Captain in Terminator armor, who both come with 2 face options. Now these face options are really cool, and particularly with the Marshal, they can even be nostalgic, but as we'll talk about in a second, there are reasons why some players prefer to have full helmets on their models, and here you're not getting that option. You're getting a choice not between A and B, but between A1 and A2, and for those players it forces them to kit bash, which isn't ideal. So that brings us to the question, can models look better with or without helmets, and should you go out of your way to kit bash one way or the other if the kit doesn't give you that option in the first place? And to kind of illustrate as I go, I'm going to use the example of the Little Horus Aximon model because I think it's a really great example of both directions. Now, to look at helmets first, I think one of the obvious kind of points people make is if you're going into a war zone, you need to be fully decked out in armor to make sure no kind of awkward stray bullets or a slip up kind of see you off the battlefield. Now, ironically, with Horus Aximon, a helmet didn't quite save him if you know the lore reference, but I do agree with the principle that having helmets on models can sometimes add to that sense of immersion, particularly if you're playing on battlefields that are particularly hazardous, or in 40k Space Hulks where there may not even be oxygen. I can only imagine what it would be like to have a renowned Terminator captain, the survivor of 100 battlefields, choked to death because he forgot his helmet when he was doing a boarding action. It's not necessarily heroic, if you know what I mean. But whether or not helmets add enough protection, I think we can all agree that sometimes they are easier to paint. I'm pretty terrible at painting faces. Flesh tones are a real nightmare when it comes to inking, and eyes have been the bane of my Warhammer painting ever since I started in the hobby, and it may be the same case for you. So while this isn't necessarily a simple helmet, actually let's look at something like the Emperor's Champion. Here it's the same tone as the armor, a few highlights, and you have a really fantastic looking model. This is what I meant when I said with the Terminator Captain, it's not great to have an option between A1 and A2 as opposed to A and B, because for me, I don't want to paint faces, so the Terminator Captain doesn't offer some good options for me. So having a helmet option can help players like me to paint models in a way that we're happy with, but they also allow us to theme our models in particular ways. I hope you can make this out, but this is my Belial model for my Dark Angels army, and you can see that I've actually put a Deathwing Knight helmet on him simply so that he can fit in alongside that unit, and it looks more akin to him having a retinue and him being part of that order. You might want to do that with other models in your army to kind of create that blending between leader and unit that I spoke about earlier. But there's also some really great themes you can create with helmets. For example, there's a really cool example I saw online, and the effect is this kind of Dark Souls vibe, which is not just a really fantastic example of kit bashing, but also it shows how helmets can create this faceless executioner vibe that I think is right at home both in 40k and in Age of Sigmar. But in any case, those are just a few of the reasons why I think helmets look really good on Warhammer models. But let's go back to Aximond and talk about why I think faces are a particularly compelling option as well. And you only have to look at his to realise all the reasons why I wish I was better at painting faces. This is an absolutely incredible model. And again, it really showcases the lore. If you look into the history of Aximond, you'll see why he looks the way he does. But first and foremost, faces allow you to exude personality. I spoke earlier about the reason the Primarchs don't often have helmets is because they're characters in a story, not necessarily warriors on the front line. And it might be the same that if you're telling a story through Crusade in 40k, for example, that you want your heroes to be unhelmed so that you can kind of convey some of that personality. If they suffer a wound, for example, you can model that onto them, or other sort of variations that give a kind of more uniqueness that you can't find if you have the model wearing a helmet. But at the same time, as you can see in this model, it gives so much energy and kind of implied narrative that otherwise the model wouldn't have. This grin, this smirk, the wounds Aximond has had, there's so much kind of stuff that begs questioning and kind of gets the mind wandering. And this is why I think faces sometimes can be a really cool option to see on models, and something we sometimes don't see enough of, because actually that's where all of the inner depth of a character can sometimes come to the surface. And it's not just the case with this particular model, but also with the older Inquisitor Kotias model. I know there's been a controversial update recently, but so much of this model's innate authority and strength is in that face. If you put a helmet on this Kotias model, which is completely fair if you want to kit bash in that way, I think it takes away from some of the character. That's my personal view. There is so much authority in that stare. It's almost penetrating in and of its own right. And it's another great example of how these faces bring in the inner strength and personality of a character to the surface. I think it's also a great example of how having an exposed face, not using the helmet option, can also add some vibrancy to the colour scheme. It's kind of the converse of what I was saying earlier when I mentioned that having helmets is sometimes easier to paint. This is far more complex to paint sometimes, but it does add some contrast to the rest of the paint scheme that can be quite aesthetically pleasing. Again, these are visual models as much as playing ones, and so yeah, having Kotias or even Aximond with his exposed head here, it just creates a kind of nice visual contrast to the rest of the model, which, you know, for my personal taste, looks really kind of cool and helps the model to stand out in a way that the helmeted one perhaps doesn't, in a very subtle way. So do Warhammer models look better with or without helmets? Well, hopefully this video has shown that there is no right answer. It comes down to what's the tone and feel you want for a particular model or across your entire army. How comfortable are you at painting flesh tones or wanting to learn how to paint flesh tones better? And I guess what sort of personality and story are you trying to tell with your models? Out of interest, I currently have my Lionel Johnson model here without his head on because I haven't really decided which head option I want to give him. He has 4, 2 unhelmed and 2 helmeted ones. And this video is very much a kind of expression of that inner debate I've been having about this particular model. And I still don't know which way I'm going to go. Maybe you can offer me some thoughts in the comments section below, because I want to hear your thoughts. Do you have your models wearing helmets, or do you go a different direction? And what sort of tips and advice would you give people who have to kit bash different options for kits that don't come with either helmeted or unhelmeted options. Let me know in the comments section below and maybe we can have a bit of a discussion about it. But as always, a big thank you for watching today. I hope this video has helped if you've been kind of weighing up that debate like me in your head, and I do hope you'll join me for future videos. Like and subscribe if you want to, and I hope to see you around for the next one. But until then, take care.